The laughter echoed through the quiet police station, a routine night shift filled with coffee, paperwork, and harmless pranks. Officers needed something to keep them entertained, and tonight, a few of them had come up with an idea, a joke that, at the time, seemed completely innocent. A man had been walking alone near the downtown area, dressed in an unremarkable hoodie and jeans, blending in with the late-night stragglers. He looked ordinary, too ordinary. One officer, grinning, suggested they pretend to arrest him just for fun. It was harmless, just a light-hearted prank, the kind that young officers played to break the monotony of long shifts. They approached him, badges flashing, keeping straight faces. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one officer said, barely containing his amusement. The man didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent an unexpected chill through the officer standing closest to him. Without hesitation, he raised his hand slightly and nodded. "All right," he said in a calm voice. There was no resistance, no confusion, no demand for an explanation. It was almost as if he had been expecting it. That was the first moment they realized something was off. Most people, when confronted by the police unexpectedly, asked questions. Most would demand to know why. But not this man. He walked with them willingly, his posture relaxed. Even when they placed him in the back of the squad car, he remained composed, staring out the window as if he had all the time in the world. Inside the station, the officers carried on with their joke, booking him into the system. They entered his name, fingerprinted him, took his photo, chuckling under their breath. It was all part of the act, until the computer screen froze. The moment stretched. One officer clicked the mouse, then the keyboard. Nothing. Then, suddenly, the screen flickered, and an alert flashed in red, "Priority Security Alert. Contact higher authorities immediately." The room went silent. One of the senior officers frowned, leaned over, and read the message again, this time out loud. The laughter that had been bubbling in the room only moments ago died instantly. "What the hell?" one of them muttered. Another officer tried typing in the man's name again, but the system refused access, flashing up "Restricted File" warning. No one in the room had ever seen anything like it before. The man sat quietly on the bench, watching them with mild amusement, as if the entire situation was entertaining. He hadn't spoken a word since they brought him in, hadn't even flinched when the alert popped up. The station phone rang, shrill and urgent. An officer picked it up, barely getting out a greeting before the voice on the other end demanded, "Who just ran that name?" The officer hesitated. One of our guys." "Listen carefully," the voice cut him off. "Do not say anything. Do not let him go. And do not, under any circumstances, speak to him." The call ended abruptly. Silence. Every officer in the room turned to look at the man, who still sat there, completely at ease, as if he knew exactly what was happening. Then the doors of the station burst open. Several high-ranking officials stormed in, their faces grave, their presence alone enough to send a ripple of anxiety through the room. One of them, a man in a black suit with a government badge clipped to his belt, scanned the room with cold, calculating eyes. His gaze landed on the man sitting on the bench. His expression hardened. The officers stepped back instinctively, their joke unraveling into something far more serious than they had ever imagined. And for the first time that night, the man finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost amused. "Took you long enough." The officer's blood ran cold. The silence in the room was suffocating. The officers, who had been laughing just moments ago, now stood frozen, their faces pale. No one spoke, no one moved. The man they had arrested as a joke sat there, completely at ease, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. The government official in the black suit stepped forward. His badge read, "Federal Bureau, Restricted Clearance." He didn't look at the officers. His eyes were locked onto the man sitting on the bench, his expression unreadable. "Get him up," he ordered, his tone sharp and unquestioning. One of the officers hesitated, then stepped forward, grabbing the man's arm as if to pull him to his feet. But before he could, the man stood on his own, moving with deliberate slowness. There was no resistance, no defiance. He was cooperating, yet somehow, it felt like he was still in control. The black-suited official turned to the ranking officer in the station. "Who authorized this arrest?" A heavy pause followed. No one wanted to answer. The truth was embarrassing, ridiculous even. This had been nothing but a harmless prank, until it wasn't. Finally, the sergeant cleared his throat, stepping forward. "It was a misunderstanding." His voice was weak, the excuse hollow. The official's jaw tightened. His gaze swept the room, landing on the computer screen where the priority security alert was still flashing. With a quick flick of his wrist, he gestured to another agent behind him. "Secure the records," he ordered. "Wipe everything. Now." The officer at the desk instinctively stepped forward. "Wait, what?" The agent behind the official was already at the station's computer, plugging in a small black device. Within seconds, the screen blinked off, replaced by a simple message: "Data corruption error. System reset required." The officers watched in stunned silence. Their entire booking record of the man was being erased, as if he had never stepped foot in their station. "What the hell is going on?" one of the younger officers muttered. No one answered. The black-suited man finally turned back to the prisoner. "You," he said. "Do you know how much trouble you've just caused?" The man smiled, a small, almost amused grin. "I wasn't the one who put myself in handcuffs," he replied. The officer closest to him shivered. There was something about this man, something unnerving. He wasn't just calm, he was completely unbothered, like he knew exactly how this was going to play out from the beginning. The black-suited man exhaled sharply through his nose, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You shouldn't be here. We buried you." "Buried?" The word hung in the air like a ghost. One of the officers finally found his voice. "Who is he?" he asked. The agent's cold eyes flickered toward the questioning officer. For a second, it looked like he might answer. But instead, he turned back to his men. "Get him out of here. Now." Two of the government agents stepped forward, grabbing the man's arms, not roughly, but with enough force to show they weren't giving him a choice. He didn't fight them, didn't protest. But just as they turned him toward the door, he paused. Slowly, he turned his head toward the group of stunned officers, his gaze settling on the sergeant who had claimed this was all a misunderstanding. The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying them. Then, with an eerie calm, he said, "You should be more careful who you play games with." A deep, unsettling silence filled the room. And then, without another word, he was gone, escorted out the door by the men in suits. For a long moment, no one moved. The entire station stood in stunned disbelief. Then the sergeant finally found his voice. "What the hell just happened?" No one had an answer. But deep down, they all knew one thing for certain: whoever that man was, they had made a mistake. A big one. And they might never know just how big. The station remained eerily silent long after the man had been taken away. The officers exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak. It felt as if they had just witnessed something they were never meant to see. Sergeant Tillman, the most senior officer in the room, exhaled sharply and turned to the desk officer. "Pull up the security footage." The officer hesitated. "Sir, they wiped everything." "What do you mean, everything?" Tillman's voice was sharper than he intended. The officer gulped, swiveling his chair back to his screen. He clicked through the station's digital logs, but every file related to the man's booking had been erased. No record of his prints, no mugshot, no written report. Even the timestamps of his arrival were blank. It was as if he had never been there. Tillman ran a hand over his face. This was bad. Really bad. He had been a cop for over 20 years, and he had never seen anything like this. Mistakes happened in the force, wrongful arrests, misidentifications, but this was different. This wasn't a mistake. This was something else. "I don't get it," one of the younger officers muttered. "Who the hell was that guy?" No one answered. A soft knock at the door made everyone jump. A tall, thin man in a gray suit stepped inside. Unlike the federal agents who had stormed in earlier, he didn't wear a badge. His presence was quiet but commanding. His expression unreadable. "I need to speak to whoever processed the arrest," he said smoothly. His voice was calm, but something about it made the hairs on the back of Tillman's neck stand up. The officers exchanged wary glances. Tillman stepped forward. "That would be me." The man in the gray suit nodded slightly. "Good. Step into your office, Sergeant." Tillman didn't like this. His gut told him to refuse, but something in the man's cold stare warned him not to push back. He swallowed hard and led the stranger into his office, shutting the door behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the man in the gray suit leaned forward, placing his hands on Tillman's desk. His fingers were long, precise, like a surgeon's. "You need to forget about what happened tonight." Tillman stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." The man's voice was still calm, but the threat beneath his words was clear. "Forget about the arrest. Forget about the man. Forget everything." Tillman's hands clenched into fists beneath the desk. "That's not how this works." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're mistaken, Sergeant. That's exactly how this works." A heavy silence filled the air. Tillman had seen his fair share of intimidation tactics before, but this was different. This wasn't a gang enforcer shaking down a witness. This wasn't a corrupt politician asking for a favor. This was something far more powerful. "Who is he?" Tillman asked, keeping his voice steady. "What did we stumble into?" The man in gray didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device. One that looked strikingly similar to the one the federal agents had used to wipe the station's data. He placed it on the desk between them. "In 10 seconds, he said, "this will erase every recording, every log, every digital footprint of our conversation. You will have no proof that I was ever here." Tillman's heart pounded. The man in gray leaned closer, his expression unreadable. "You need to understand something, Sergeant. There are things in this world that don't belong in police reports. And there are people, very important people, who don't exist in any database." He tapped the black device lightly with one finger. "Your little prank tonight could have caused problems. But we're giving you a chance to walk away." Tillman stared at him, his mind racing. He had two choices: push for answers and risk consequences he couldn't predict, or do what the man wanted and pretend this never happened. "Why should I trust you?" Tillman asked. The man in gray chuckled softly. "Trust? Sergeant, you don't have a choice." He pressed a button on the black device. The screen on Tillman's office computer blinked once, then went completely dark. Just like that, everything was gone. Tillman's stomach turned. He had worked too hard, followed the law for too long, to be bullied into silence. But as he looked into the cold, calculating eyes of the man in gray, he realized something. This wasn't just about him. If he pushed too hard, if he didn't let this go, his entire department could pay the price. The man in gray straightened his suit, as if the conversation had already ended. "Forget tonight, Sergeant," he said as he turned toward the door. It never happened. Tillman clenched his jaw, watching him leave. The door clicked shut behind him. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, it should have been. But Tillman knew better. Something told him that this wasn't the last time he'd hear about the man they arrested that night. Something told him that this was just the beginning. Sergeant Tillman sat in his office long after the man in gray had left. The silence in the station felt heavier now, like a weight pressing down on him. The other officers had returned to their posts, but no one was talking. No one was laughing. The prank that had seemed harmless just hours ago had unraveled into something far more sinister. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The logical part of his brain told him to do what the man in gray had said, to let this go. But another part, the part that had spent 20 years upholding the law, refused to accept that an entire event could just disappear. Someone had been here. Someone real. And someone powerful had just wiped him from existence. Tillman glanced at his desk, where the small black device had sat just minutes ago. The man in gray had taken it with him, leaving nothing behind. Not even a trace. But then his eyes flickered to something else, his personal notepad. A single sheet of paper was torn slightly at the corner, likely from when the black device had been pressed onto the desk. Ink transfer. It was faint, barely noticeable, but there was an imprint on the paper from where the device had rested. He carefully lifted the page and tilted it under the light. A string of numbers. His heartbeat quickened. The device had erased everything digital, but it had left a mark on the physical world. He grabbed a pencil and lightly shaded over the imprint, revealing a full sequence, 18227495128 code? Coordinates? An identification number? He didn't know. But it was something. His fingers hovered over the numbers for a moment before he exhaled sharply and ripped the page out, folding it into his pocket. This wasn't over. Not for him. The next morning, Tillman arrived at the station early. The entire place still felt off, as if the events of the previous night had left a permanent stain on the air. He wasn't the only one who felt it. Officer Davis, one of the younger patrolmen, hesitated before approaching his desk. His expression was uneasy. "Sarge, something's weird." Tillman looked up. "What now?" Davis glanced around before lowering his voice. "I went to pull last night's patrol logs, just to double-check the route times, but they're gone." Tillman frowned. "Wiped?" Davis nodded. "Not just ours. Every patrol car's GPS data from last night is missing. No records of stops, no radio calls, nothing. Like the whole night never happened." A slow, cold realization settled in Tillman's chest. The man in gray hadn't just wiped their in-house records, he had gone further. The entire city system had been scrubbed clean of any evidence that the mysterious man had ever been picked up. Someone really didn't want him to exist. Davis hesitated again before speaking. "Sarge, should we just forget about this?" Tillman studied him for a long moment. Davis wasn't just asking for himself, he was speaking for everyone. The officers were shaken. They had seen something they weren't meant to see, and now they were being warned to stay silent. If they pushed, there would be consequences. Tillman took a deep breath. "No," he said finally. "I need to know what we got ourselves into." Davis swallowed hard, nodding, but Tillman could see the nervousness in his eyes. This was dangerous. He knew that. But after 2 decades of service, he had learned one thing: fear was the easiest tool for control. And whoever had wiped last night from existence was counting on that fear to keep them quiet. Later that afternoon, Tillman sat in his car, the folded note burning a hole in his pocket. He had spent the morning running the numbers through every system he had access to, but nothing came up. So he was left with one last option. An old contact. Someone who had long since retired from government work but still knew the ins and outs of classified operations. A man who owed Tillman a favor. The coffee shop was nearly empty when he arrived. He spotted his contact sitting in the back booth, stirring a cup of black coffee. "Didn't expect to hear from you," the man said as Tillman slid into the seat across from him. "I need a favor," Tillman replied, placing the note on the table. "Tell me what this means." The man glanced at the numbers and let out a slow, quiet breath. Tillman caught the flicker of recognition in his expression. He knew what this was. After a long pause, the man leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Where did you get this?" Tillman hesitated. He wasn't about to give away everything, not yet. "Does it matter?" The man's jaw tensed. He looked around the cafe before sliding the note back across the table. "Walk away from this, Tillman." His voice was firm, almost pleading. "This isn't something you want to get involved in." Tillman's stomach twisted. "I don't have a choice." The man exhaled sharply. "That's an old tracking sequence," he said finally. "Used for individuals who disappear." Tillman's pulse quickened. "Disappear?" The man nodded. "Not just anyone. Ghosts. People who were erased from the system on purpose. People with classified pasts. When someone like that resurfaces, even for a moment, the sequence reactivates." A chill ran down Tillman's spine. He had assumed the man they arrested was someone important. But this was something else entirely. Who was he? Tillman pressed. What was he involved in? The man hesitated. Then, finally, he whispered, "Someone the government swore never existed." Tillman's grip tightened on the note. He wasn't supposed to know this. But now that he did, he couldn't turn back. This wasn't just about a prank gone wrong. This was about a man who shouldn't exist, and the people who would do anything to keep it that way. Sergeant Tillman sat in his car outside the cafe, gripping the note like it was the last piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. A ghost. That's what his contact had called the man they had arrested. Someone erased from existence by the highest authorities. The words sent a chill through him. He had dealt with high-profile criminals before, had even crossed paths with classified operations in his years on the force. But this? This was something else. His contact's warning echoed in his mind. Walk away from this, Tillman. He knew he should. Every instinct told him to drop it, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But he also knew himself well enough to realize that was impossible. Because one question kept gnawing at him. Why did this man allow himself to be arrested? Nothing about that night made sense. A person capable of evading the system for what seemed like years wouldn't just stroll into a trap. He wouldn't just sit back and let himself get taken in, unless he wanted to be caught. But why? He needed more information. And he knew exactly where to start. Back at the station, Tillman made sure his office door was shut before pulling up a restricted database he wasn't supposed to have access to. His badge alone wouldn't get him in, but a few backdoor tricks he'd picked up over the years did the job. The screen flickered. A search bar appeared. He hesitated before typing in the numbers from the note. 18227495512. The system took longer than expected. The progress wheel spun for nearly 30 seconds before finally returning something. Match found. Tillman's breath caught. The file that popped up was mostly blacked out, classified beyond his clearance level. But one line of text stood out, untouched by the redactions. Status, unknown. Last recorded sighting, unverified. Risk level, severe. Risk level? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trying to decipher what that could mean. If this man was a former government asset, why would he be labeled as dangerous? Was he a defector? A whistleblower? Or something worse? Then, another alert popped up. Access logged. Unauthorized user detected. Report issued. His stomach dropped. They knew he was looking. He slammed his laptop shut, heart pounding. He had barely scratched the surface, and already, someone out there knew he was digging where he wasn't supposed to. A knock on his office door made him jump. "Yeah," he called, trying to steady his voice. Officer Davis poked his head inside, looking uneasy. "Sarge, you've got a visitor." Tillman frowned. "Who?" Davis hesitated. "That guy from the other night." Tillman's blood ran cold. "The man we arrested?" Davis shook his head. "No. One of them. The agents." Tillman stood, taking a deep breath before following Davis out to the front of the station. Sure enough, standing near the entrance was a familiar figure. The man in gray. He looked exactly the same as the night before, calm, unreadable, but there was something different this time. A purpose in his stance. "Sergeant," he greeted smoothly. "Let's talk." Tillman crossed his arms. "What now?" "You already erased my reports, wiped my station's data. What else is left?" The man in gray gave a small, humorless smile. "You should have left it at that." Tillman's jaw tightened. "What are you saying?" The man leaned in slightly. "I'm saying you crossed a line today." Tillman felt his stomach twist. They knew. They had tracked him the moment he searched the database. The man in gray gestured to a bench outside the station. "Let's not make a scene, Sergeant. Have a seat." Tillman didn't move at first. His instincts screamed at him to push back, but logic told him that would be a mistake. With a slow breath, he followed the agent outside. The two of them sat, the tension thick between them. The man in gray was the first to speak. "You're a good cop, Tillman. You do your job well. You've built a career out of asking the right questions." Tillman remained silent. "But sometimes, asking the right questions leads to the wrong answers." The man's voice was calm, but his words carried weight. "And you will find the wrong answers if you keep going down this path." Tillman narrowed his eyes. "That a threat?" The man in gray sighed. "No, Sergeant. It's a fact." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you know why we erased everything? Why we scrubbed your records, wiped your logs, removed every trace of that man?" Tillman didn't answer. The man's expression hardened. "Because the people looking for him? They're worse than us." A slow chill crept up Tillman's spine. "This isn't about us covering up an old operation," the man continued. "This isn't some government conspiracy to keep secrets buried. This is about keeping you alive." Tillman clenched his fists. "What did he do?" The man in gray exhaled. "It's not about what he did. It's about what he knows." The words sent a fresh wave of unease through him. The agent leaned back. "You have one last chance, Sergeant. Walk away. Pocket. Forget the name. Forget the numbers. Forget you ever saw him." Tillman felt his pulse in his ears. He had spent his entire life pursuing truth. He had built his entire career around seeking justice. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the truth. Because if the man in gray was telling the truth, then the question wasn't who they had arrested. It was what happens now that he's free. Sergeant Tillman sat on the station bench long after the man in gray had left. His warning echoed in his head. The people looking for him? They're worse than us. That should have been enough. That should have convinced him to stop, to let this go. But instead, it only raised more questions. Who was looking for the man they had arrested? And why did the government, the same government that had erased every trace of his existence, now want to protect him. Nothing added up. Tillman exhaled, rubbing his temples. He had spent 20 years in law enforcement, priding himself on his ability to read people. And if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was this: when someone tells you to stop looking, that's when you know you're close to something real. He wasn't stopping. Not yet. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. If he wanted real answers, he needed someone who wasn't on the government's radar. He hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Tillman. Ben, Tillman said quietly. I need your help. A pause. You asking me as a cop or as a friend? Both. Another pause, then a low chuckle. This is about your little disappearing man, isn't it? Tillman stiffened. You heard? Ben sighed. You're not the only one asking questions, old friend. They met in a parking lot just outside city limits, far away from cameras and prying eyes. Ben was a former intelligence analyst who had left government work years ago. One of the few people Tillman trusted when it came to off-the-books investigations. The moment Tillman stepped out of his car, Ben shook his head. You really don't know what you've stepped into, do you? Tillman frowned. Then tell me. Ben glanced around before pulling out a tablet. He tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward Tillman. This is what I found when I ran those numbers you gave me. The screen displayed an old satellite image of a compound in the middle of nowhere. No labels. No official records. But the moment Tillman saw it, a cold feeling settled in his stomach. What is that? Ben's expression darkened. A place that technically doesn't exist. A research site, government, private contractors, international players, all mixed together. It was shut down years ago. Wiped clean. Tillman studied the image. Something about it felt wrong. What were they working on? Ben hesitated. That's where things get murky. But from the scattered reports I found, it wasn't weapons, not in the traditional sense. He looked Tillman in the eye. They were working on people. Tillman's stomach twisted. Genetic experiments, he asked, his voice lower now. Not exactly. Ben exhaled. More like intelligence manipulation. Human enhancement. Things that crossed a lot of ethical lines. People disappeared into that facility, Tillman. People with skill sets the government wanted to modify. A heavy silence passed between them. Tillman swallowed. And the man we arrested, he came from there? Ben nodded. All signs point to it. Tillman took a slow breath. It all made sense now. The reason he had no record, the reason the feds wiped every trace of him, it wasn't just about secrecy. It was about control. If this man was one of their experiments, and he had somehow escaped the program, then that meant someone out there wanted him back. And someone else wanted him to stay hidden. Tillman clenched his fists. Why would he let himself get arrested? Ben's jaw tightened. I don't know. Tillman looked away, deep in thought. I need to find him. Ben tensed. You sure about that? You really think he wants to be found? Tillman shook his head. I don't know what he wants. But I know one thing, if we found him once, so can the people who are hunting him. Ben was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed. You always were a stubborn bastard. He tapped his tablet again, pulling up a map. If he's smart, and I'm guessing he is, he'll stay off the grid. No bank transactions, no registered addresses. But people like him? They leave trails in different ways. Tillman studied the screen. What am I looking at? Ben smirked. A place where ghosts tend to resurface. It was a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind where people checked in under fake names and never stayed more than a night or two. Tillman's gut told him this was it. Then that's where I'm going. Ben sighed. You're not going alone. Tillman shot him a look. Ben, no arguments, Sergeant. Ben's voice was firm. If you're doing this, you're going to need backup. You're about to walk straight into something you don't understand. Tillman hesitated. Then he nodded. Let's move. That night, Tillman and Ben parked across the street from the motel. The neon sign flickered dimly, casting eerie red light across the parking lot. Tillman scanned the rows of parked cars, his instincts on high alert. Then he saw him. The man they had arrested. He was standing in the shadows near the edge of the lot, watching them. And he wasn't alone. A black SUV idled at the curb nearby. The moment Tillman spotted it, he knew, they weren't the only ones who had tracked him down. Ben muttered under his breath. Looks like the real hunt just started. Tillman's pulse pounded. They had found their ghost. But so had someone else. Tillman's breath slowed as his instincts kicked in. This was no longer just about tracking a missing man, it had turned into a hunt, and he wasn't sure who was the predator and who was the prey. The black SUV idling near the motel told him everything he needed to know. Whoever was inside wasn't here by coincidence. Ben muttered under his breath, "You seeing this?" Tillman gave a slight nod. "Yeah. And I don't like it." The man they had arrested, the ghost, stood near the motel entrance, his expression unreadable as he watched the SUV. He wasn't panicking, wasn't running. If anything, he looked patient. Like he was waiting for this. "What do we do?" Ben asked. Tillman weighed their options. If they approached him now, they'd risk drawing attention. If they waited too long, the people in the SUV might move first. Then, as if deciding for them, the back door of the SUV opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. His suit was crisp, his posture rigid. He wasn't law enforcement, Tillman knew that immediately. No badge, no markings. Just the kind of quiet authority that made people obey without question. The ghost turned his head slightly, acknowledging the man. A silent understanding passed between them. And then, suddenly, the ghost moved. It was fast. Too fast. 1 second he was standing still, the next he was crossing the parking lot in a blur of motion, heading straight for the darkened alley beside the motel. The suited man didn't hesitate. He raised a hand, and 2 other figures emerged from the SUV, following the ghost into the alley. Tillman's heart pounded. "This isn't good," Ben muttered. Tillman didn't wait. "We're going in." They moved fast, crossing the street with purpose, but staying out of sight. As soon as they reached the alley, Tillman pressed himself against the brick wall and peeked around the corner. The ghost stood at the far end, his back to the wall. The 3 men from the SUV were blocking his only escape route. The leader, the man in the suit, spoke first. "You should have stayed hidden." The ghost gave a small smile. "Funny. I was about to say the same to you." The tension crackled like static in the air. Tillman's grip tightened. If this turned into a fight, he had no doubt who would win. The ghost wasn't a regular man. There was something different about him, something beyond his ability to vanish from government records. One of the suited men took a step forward. "We're not here to hurt you." The ghost tilted his head slightly. "That's disappointing." The suited man hesitated, as if unsure how to proceed. Then the ghost sighed. "Fine. You want to talk? Let's talk." Tillman and Ben exchanged a glance. "We need to get closer," Tillman whispered. They crept forward, staying in the shadows. The ghost crossed his arms. "Let's cut to the chase. You want me back?" The suited man nodded. You know why. The ghost chuckled, shaking his head. That's the thing, I don't know why. If you erased me, you must have had a reason. And now, all of a sudden, you want me back. His eyes darkened. That tells me something's changed. The suited man remained silent. The ghost's smile faded. You lost control of something, didn't you? Tillman felt a chill run down his spine. The ghost took a step forward. That's why you're here. Not to clean up a loose end. His voice dropped lower. But because there's another one. The suited man's jaw tightened. That was it. That was the truth. The ghost wasn't the only one out there. There was someone else. Tillman felt his pulse quicken. If the government was willing to erase one man, how many others had they buried? And worse, who had escaped? The suited man finally spoke. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The ghost smirked. I have a pretty good guess. Then, in a blink, he moved. One moment he was standing still, the next he was past them, sprinting down the alley. The suited men reacted too late. Go, one of them shouted. Tillman didn't think. He bolted after the ghost. Tillman. Ben hissed, but Tillman ignored him. The ghost cut through a side street, weaving effortlessly through the shadows. Tillman pushed himself faster, adrenaline surging through his veins. He didn't know why he was chasing him. He just knew he had to. The ghost darted into a rundown industrial lot, where old shipping containers lined the space. He skidded to a stop, turning sharply. And for the first time, he looked directly at Tillman. Tillman froze. The ghost exhaled, shaking his head. You shouldn't be here, Sergeant. Tillman steadied his breathing. Then stop running and tell me what's going on. The ghost studied him for a moment. Then, finally, he spoke. There's more of us, he said quietly. And one of them isn't hiding anymore. Tillman's stomach dropped. Before he could respond, headlights flashed across the lot. The suited men had caught up. The ghost's eyes flickered to the oncoming danger. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and tossed something at Tillman. A small, silver USB drive. Tillman caught it instinctively. Find the truth, the ghost said. Then he turned and ran. Tillman didn't chase him this time. Because whatever was on that USB, it was something he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Sergeant Tillman stood frozen in the middle of the industrial lot, the cold weight of the USB drive in his hand. The ghost had vanished into the night, again. And this time, Tillman wasn't sure if he'd ever see him again. But that didn't matter anymore. Because now, he had something real. Something physical. Behind him, the black SUV screeched to a halt. The suited men jumped out, their expressions cold and professional. They had lost their target, and they knew it. The leader, the same one who had confronted the ghost, locked eyes with Tillman. Where did he go? Tillman clenched his jaw. I don't know. The man studied him carefully. Did he give you anything? Tillman's grip on the USB tightened in his pocket. No, a tense silence followed. Then the suited man sighed. You're in over your head, Sergeant. Tillman's eyes narrowed. So tell me what's going on. The man shook his head. It's better if you don't know. Tillman exhaled sharply, glancing at the industrial lot around them. The night was eerily quiet now. The ghost was gone, leaving nothing but more questions. He turned back to the suited man. If it's so dangerous, why did you let him go? The man's expression darkened. Because we don't let him do anything. That sent a chill through Tillman. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. If I were you, Sergeant, I'd stop asking questions. I'd go home, pretend this never happened, and move on with my life. Tillman held his ground. And if I don't? The man gave a small, humorless smile. Then I hope you're as good at disappearing as he is. With that, he turned back to the SUV. The suited men climbed in, and within moments, they were gone, their tires screeching as they sped into the night. Tillman stood there for a long moment, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Then, finally, he pulled the USB from his pocket. It was time to see what the ghost had left him. Back in his apartment, Tillman locked the door, pulled the blinds shut, and booted up his old personal laptop, the one that wasn't connected to any department network. He hesitated for only a second before plugging in the USB. The screen flickered. A single file appeared. Revelation, no other labels. No explanation. Just one file. Tillman clicked it open. At first, it looked like a standard report. Rows of data, dates, locations, most of it meant nothing to him. But then, he started recognizing certain names. Government agencies. Private contractors. Research facilities that had long been shut down. And then, Project Vanguard. Subject number 017. Tillman's stomach dropped. He read the first few lines of the report. His hands started to shake. The ghost, the man they had arrested, wasn't just a former asset. He was a survivor of something the government had buried. The file detailed an experiment, one that had started decades ago. A classified program designed to enhance human intelligence, adaptability, and perception beyond normal limits. But something had gone wrong. Test subjects had disappeared. Others had died under mysterious circumstances. And a select few, like subject number 017, had vanished completely, their records erased, their existence denied. Tillman scrolled further. His breath caught when he reached the final section of the document. Status, subject number 017 confirmed alive. Location unknown. Additional concern, subject number 021 confirmed escaped. Status, unaccounted for. Tillman's pulse pounded. There was another one. The ghost had hinted at it, but now he had proof. Another person, another experiment, had escaped. And if the people hunting subject number 017 were this desperate to bring him back, then subject number 021 had to be even worse. A new document appeared at the bottom of the file. A surveillance photo. It was grainy, but the figure in it was clear. A man, dressed in dark clothing, walking alone through a crowded city street. His face wasn't visible, but something about the image sent a chill through Tillman. The timestamp was from yesterday. Whoever subject number 021 was, he was here. In the city. Right now. And he wasn't hiding anymore. Tillman ran a hand over his face. His heart was pounding. He had been looking for answers, but now that he had them, he almost wished he hadn't. The ghost had been running from something. Now, Tillman knew what. And worse, he had no idea what subject number 021 was capable of. His phone buzzed. He nearly jumped. It was a message. No sender ID. Just a single sentence. They know you have the file. Tillman's blood ran cold. Then, another message. Run. Tillman's pulse pounded in his ears. He stared at the message on his phone, the glow of the screen illuminating his tense face in the darkened apartment. They know you have the file. Run. His instincts screamed at him to move, to get out, but years of experience had trained him to suppress panic. He needed a plan. He needed to understand what was happening before making a mistake that could get him killed. He grabbed the USB and yanked it from his laptop. Whatever was on it, whatever they knew, he had to assume they were already on their way. His mind raced through options. Escape? No. If they wanted him dead, they wouldn't have warned him. They wanted the file. Stay and fight? Not an option. Whoever was coming for him wasn't some random street gang. This was government-level pursuit. Expose the truth? His breath steadied. Yes. That was the only way to end this. Tillman pulled out his phone and quickly scrolled through his contacts. He needed someone outside the system. Someone the government couldn't immediately silence. A journalist. He found the number he was looking for, Lisa Durant, an investigative reporter he had worked with years ago. She had exposed corruption in law enforcement, unraveling deep-seated conspiracies. If anyone could get this story out before it was buried, it was her. He hit dial. The phone rang once. Twice. Then a voice answered. Tillman? Lisa sounded surprised. It's been years. What's going on? I don't have time to explain, he said quickly. I have something big. I need to meet you. Now. She hesitated. What is it? A government black site. A classified experiment. And a man who doesn't officially exist. The silence on the other end was enough to confirm that she knew he wasn't joking. Where? She asked. Fulton Warehouse. 1 hour. Got it. He hung up and grabbed his coat. But as he moved toward the door, his apartment lights flickered. Then went dark. His breath caught. He reached for his gun. A second later, his phone screen blinked, NO signal. They were already here. Tillman slipped into the stairwell instead of taking the elevator. He moved fast but quiet, years of police training guiding his every step. As he reached the bottom floor, he paused. Through the glass lobby doors, he saw a black SUV pull up. 3 men stepped out. He recognized the one in the lead. The man in gray. The same one who had warned him before. Tillman clenched his jaw. They weren't coming to talk this time. He scanned the exit routes. The back alley led to another street, but if they had a second team, they'd be covering all exits. That left him with one choice. Force his way out. He squared his shoulders and stepped out the front door. The man in gray's expression remained neutral. Sergeant. Tillman didn't slow. If you're here to threaten me, you're wasting your time. The man exhaled. You're making a mistake. No, Tillman stopped in front of him. The mistake was thinking you could bury this forever. The man's gaze flickered to Tillman's hand, where he was gripping the USB tightly. You think that's your protection? The man's voice was almost pitying. That's not leverage, Tillman. That's a target on your back. Tillman smirked. Then why haven't you taken it? The man's expression remained unreadable. Because I don't need to. He gestured behind him. Tillman turned, and his stomach dropped. Another black SUV had pulled up. From the back seat, the ghost stepped out. But his posture was different now. He wasn't running anymore. He was with them. Tillman felt his breath hitch. What is this? He demanded. The ghost met his eyes. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, You need to listen, Sergeant. Tillman's grip on the USB tightened. So you were working for them all along? The ghost shook his head. No. But they aren't the enemy you think they are. Tillman's mind raced. He had been so sure, so convinced, that this was about a cover-up. But what if? What's on this drive? Tillman asked. The ghost exhaled. A warning. Tillman frowned. A warning about what? The man in gray finally spoke again. About subject number 021. A slow realization crept over Tillman. This wasn't about silencing him. It was about keeping him alive. He looked at the ghost. The one who escaped. The ghost nodded. I was the experiment that worked, Sergeant. His expression darkened. But subject number 021 was the one that failed. Tillman's pulse pounded. The government wasn't hunting him. They were hunting someone else. Someone worse. The man in gray stepped forward. We erased his existence for a reason. You revealing the truth won't stop him. Tillman swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, he didn't know if exposing the truth was the right call. What if he had been wrong? What if keeping this buried was the only thing keeping people safe? The ghost sighed. You still have a choice. Tillman looked at the USB in his hand. It contained all the proof he needed to blow this open. To expose everything. But if he did, it might unleash something far worse. A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Tillman made his choice. He dropped the USB to the ground. And crushed it beneath his boot. The ghost nodded, almost approvingly. Smart man. The man in gray sighed. Let's go. Tillman watched as they climbed back into their vehicles, the black SUVs disappearing into the night. Just like that, it was over. The next morning, Tillman sat in his office, staring at an empty desk. No files. No reports. No evidence. Everything from the past few days was gone. It was as if none of it had ever happened. But he knew the truth. And sometimes, knowing was enough. His phone buzzed. A message. You did the right thing. No number. No trace. Tillman sighed, leaning back in his chair. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he had done the right thing. But he had done the only thing that made sense. Because sometimes, the most dangerous truth is the one that never gets told.